Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Today we'll be looking at the stories making today's newspaper headlines. Firstly, we'll start from the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper on page 5, which is boldly written on the link page, PFIPC. Police nabbed Director General Adeyemi in Osun village hideouts. At the top of the newspaper on page 9, ADC insists appeal court verdict has no effect on presidential ticket. To read more on that, you go to page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. On page 30 of the newspaper, which is written, Why Tinubu didn't call Makinde over Oriri rescue. This is coming from SGF. At the bottom of the newspaper on xenophobia, South Africa returnees recounts ordeals. South African returnees recounts ordeal. To read more on that, you go to page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust, which is boldly written, Phantom Council Director General detained. At the top of the newspaper on page 8, rescued Oyo pupils. Teachers reunite with families. During the beginning of the week, the Oyo pupils and teachers were being rescued. So to read more on that, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. And still on page 8 of the newspaper, which is written, Parents demand justice over alleged assault of 5-year-old daughter. To read more on that, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. On page 13 of the newspaper, 3 parties failed to submit presidential candidates as INEC shuts portal. The 3 parties that failed to submit their presidential candidates are the APGA, PDP, and LP. To read more on that, you go to page 13 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 6, federal government expands intervention powers in state police bill. Away from that newspaper to the Punch. On the Punch newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, Fake agency scandal. How IGP Special Forces arrested controversial Director General in Osun hideout. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the Punch newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on Oyo school adoption, Senate, SGF fought Makinde's UN probe demand. To read more on that, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. Still at the top of the newspaper, Reps dump on state police bill, adopt Tinubu's version. To read more on that, you go to page 9 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, manhunt begins for killers of Lagos NURTW leader. To read more on that on manhunt, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government grants Shell $11.5 barrel tax credits to unlock $20 billion investment. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the Punch newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper on page 6, which is boldly written there, fuel jumps by 100 naira per litre as Dangote shifts $1.84 billion FX burden to marketers. To read more on that story, go to page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Abbas defend decision to prioritize Tinubu state police bill. Governor Akpabio and Abbas defend decision to prioritize Tinubu state police bill. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the Guardian newspaper. APC, battle for regulation may cripple power reforms. NERC warns that battle for regulation may cripple power reforms. To read more on that, you go to page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on Oriri kidnapping, Senate, lawyers, CSOs divided over Makinde's push for UN probe. To read more on that story, go to page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph, which is boldly written, State Police, Reps reverse passage, adopt Tinubu's version. To read more on that story, go to page 2, 4, 5, and 6 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, this is coming from reports, Nigerians projected to import 2.55 trillion naira worth of used vehicles in 4 years. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, of a bank robbery, Saraki's lawyers tells judge to rescue himself. Saraki lawyers tells judge to rescue himself. To read more on that story, go to page 31 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on insecurity, US Nigeria targets ISIS perpetrators of anti-Christian violence. So the US and Nigeria has targeted ISIS and the perpetrators of anti-Christian violence. To read more on that story, go to page 2, 5, and 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On the Daily Sun, which is boldly written, Senate to federal government. Intensify military operations against terrorists. This is coming from Senate to federal government. They should intensify military operations against terrorists. To read more on that story, go to page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, still on page 6, ADC rift worsens as faction threatens Atiku with legal action. To read more on that story, go to page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on party primaries, we legislated against ourselves, says Akpabio. This is coming from Akpabio on party primaries. He said, we legislated against ourselves. To read more on that story, still go to page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, NYSC threatens to blacklist hostile corps employers over welfare accommodation. To read more on that, you go to page 26 of the newspaper. Still at the bottom of the newspaper, oil hits 1 month high of $86.79 as US-Iran conflict escalates. To read more on that, you go to page 25 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the mattress. On the mattress, which is boldly written on PFIPC scandal. Adeyemi nabbed in Osun. Adeyemi nabbed in Osun. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the mattress newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, UBA Business Series expand focus on innovation, African startups. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on 2027, ADC demands criminal proof of Nafiu Bala over alleged fake INEC upload claims. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. On entertainment in mattress, video of DJ Chicken in Kikiri sparks reactions online. Video of DJ Chicken in Kikiri sparks so many reactions online. To read more on that story, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. On sports, World Cup, Silky Spain sent France packing. Silky Spain sent France packing. To read more on that story, go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Still in the Matrix newspaper, Senate honors 3 security operatives killed in Oyo rescue mission. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. State Police, this is coming from State Police. Tinubu formally writes Reps 6 constitutional backing. Tinubu formally writes Reps 6 constitutional backing. To read more on that story, go to page 9 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government taps Tiraba, Owaleke, Alumona to drive Nigeria's economic reforms. This is coming from the federal government. They should tap Tiraba, Owaleke, Alumona to drive Nigeria's economic reforms. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the last newspaper for today, which is the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor, which is boldly written, suspend your COS to allow unfettered proof of allegations against him. This is coming from Atiku to Tinubu, that he should suspend his COS to allow unfettered proof of allegations against him. At the top of the newspaper, Senate urges federal government to intensify military operations against terrorists and bandits. Still in the same newspaper, Presidency reaffirms commitment to productive relationship with NASS. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the newspaper. And on page 2 of the newspaper, Appeal Court reserves judgment on appeal against the registration of ADC and 4 others. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the Daily Monitor newspaper. And still on page 4 of the Daily Monitor newspaper, which is written, Report duty exemptions hit 34 trillion naira in 2025, says Customs. This is coming from Customs. To read more on that, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, how we arrested fake PFIPC Director General, says police. This is coming from police, saying that how they arrested fake PFIPC Director General. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Osun. Do have a beautiful day.